Today we pick up with Renaissance and Reformation. So, the Renaissance in Italy. It begins in Italy, and Renaissance means rebirth. And so, if you think about what was going on at the end of the High Middle Ages with the Black Death and the Hundred Years' War and all those horrible things that were happening, this time period that follows is going to be called the Renaissance because it's seen as a time where they're recovering and everything's coming back. It's a time of creativity and a time of change in many areas like political, social, economic, and cultural areas. And these changes are going to take place in the way that the people of Europe viewed themselves, as well as how they viewed their world. And it also is going to reawaken an interest in classical learning, especially Roman classical learning. So we're going to see the development of new attitudes. There's an emphasis on individual achievement. And we get this Renaissance ideal of what is a perfect Renaissance person. And a perfect Renaissance person is someone with talent in a lot of different areas, that they're not just good at one thing, they're good at multiple different things. And so when you hear somebody being referred to as a Renaissance man or woman today, well, they're talking about somebody who has a lot of talent in a lot of different areas. Like they're good at art, and they can sing, and they can dance, and they can play sports, and they're also very well read or whatever. But they're very, very talented in a lot of different areas. So like I said, this all begins in Italy, and Italy is going to be the birthplace of the Renaissance. And why is that? Well, remember, they wanted to focus on Roman learning, Roman education. And so Italy was the center of Rome, the Roman Empire. In addition to that, the cities of Italy survived the Middle Ages fairly intact. They weren't completely devastated by war the way those in France and England were. They suffered some problems with the Black Plague, but weren't completely wiped out the way some other areas were. So they end up being fairly prosperous centers of trade and manufacturing. Also in Italy, you see a very wealthy and powerful merchant class, and they're going to be kind of the driving force behind a lot of this because they provided a lot of political and economic leadership. They also stressed education and individual leadership, that you need to be educated so that you can be a very strong individual and lead your family or lead your business. And because they have a lot of extra wealth, they are also going to lavishly support the arts. And so that's why in this Renaissance time, we're going to see a lot of development of things like art and music and literature. So with the Renaissance, there's a movement called humanism. And humanism is going to focus on worldly subjects rather than religious ones. In the High Middle Ages and the early Middle Ages, there was a lot of focus on religion and religious subjects. If you think like Canterbury Tales, you have pilgrims that are on a pilgrimage going to Canterbury, and they're telling moral stories that are Bible related. The Divine Comedy by Dante talks about a journey into hell. So it's much more religious overtones and a lot of more religious subject matter that they're going to be writing about. In the Renaissance, they're focused more on how people behave and what people should do and the here and now as opposed to the afterlife. So the Renaissance is seen as this sort of golden age in the arts, in painting and sculpture and architecture, and humanism is going to be reflected in those arts as well. Artists are going to they'll still portray religious figures, but they do it in a more Greek or Roman style or with Roman backdrops. And so you have Jesus who is standing in front of the Parthenon or that kind of thing. They also are going to portray very well-known figures of the time, and that's showing that they were very interested in these people's individual achievement. Remember, that was a big thing of how much can you learn and how much can you know and how much can you demonstrate. So one of the early humanist artists of the Renaissance is a man named Donatello, and he is going to revive those classic forms of the Romans and the Greeks. And he does that, one of the first things that he creates is a life-size statue of a man on horseback, which was, for him, it was the first time that this had been done since ancient times. And so he was bringing back classical, ancient ways of sculpting that had been lost throughout the Middle Ages. And so he's reviving that tradition. We also see an increase in realism within the arts as well, and making things more realistic. And part of this is done through something called perspective. And perspective is where you are putting distant, or you're making, when you're drawing, you are drawing distant objects smaller, so it seems like they're further away. So it's a technique that's used in art forms in order to make it look like there's distance, there's depth to the piece of work. Perspective also allows you to get, three-dimensional appearance. So it looks like maybe they could just pop right off the screen or off the canvas. Shading is part of that as well, making objects appear round and more realistic. And a lot of that comes from the study of anatomy. A lot of these artists are going to become very good at determining muscle and how muscle tone and bone structure and all kinds of stuff to get it more accurately depicted, like looking at your veins and that kind of stuff too, and getting that depicted in their artwork. Probably the most famous one for doing this is Leonardo da Vinci. He is one of the most brilliant of the Renaissance men. He's known as a painter. He paints a lot of famous paintings, but probably his most famous is the Mona Lisa. And the Mona Lisa, we still to this day do not know who this painting is of. Her identity remains a secret. But it was very interesting the way he painted her, because he painted her with this mysterious smile. And that was odd for the time, because typically when you painted a portrait, it was multiple sittings, and so you wanted to have a facial expression that could be replicated time and time again. So not a smile, you'd want to have something that's a little easier to maintain. So they usually would be straight-faced, and so having somebody with a smile means that this is a woman who either really enjoyed what she was doing, like sitting for the painting, or she was having a good time. So, it's kind of an interesting concept. But Da Vinci is also very well known for a lot of his anatomical depictions. He would dissect corpses, dead bodies, in order to learn how muscles and bones work together, and where the tendons were, and vein structure, all kinds of stuff. So he would actually pay people to bring him dead bodies so he could cut them open and check things out and see how it was made. And then he would bring that into his paintings and depict it that way. But he was much more than just a painter. He was interested in botany, which is plants, and anatomy, obviously, with body structure. He was interested in optics, which has to do with seeing, music, architecture, all kinds of engineering. He drew the first diagrams or plans for a flying machine, like a helicopter, and submarines. First design came through Da Vinci. And so that if you think Renaissance period, this is a long time ago that he was already coming up with these ideas. The next major artist, or another major artist of this time period, is Michelangelo. And he also was a Renaissance man, that he had multiple talents in many different fields. He was a sculptor, he was an engineer, he was a painter, he was an architect, he was a poet, all kinds of stuff that he was involved in. But as a sculptor, he's probably most famous, painting and sculpting, probably most famous. But there's a couple of different things. He creates the Pieta, which is a statue, and it shows Mary as she is cradling the dead Christ as he comes off of the cross. And so Mary holding her son her dead son. I think there's a replica of it in the St. Mary's Church here. It's not the exact one. That would be worth millions of dollars, but it's a replica, a smaller replica of it. He's also very famous for the sculpture of David. And David was created in the Greek tradition of having a nude male. And it follows, or it's a depiction of David, the hero from the Bible, from David and Goliath. David slew the giant Goliath. And even though he was much more undersized and only had a slingshot, he was able to slay the giant, kind of thing. But it depicts David in a very Grecian style, very Greek style, which was very much aware of body structure and wanted to emphasize the beauty of the human form. So something that is very Aristotle or Socrates way of thinking. So then we have Raphael, and Raphael was younger than Da Vinci and Michelangelo by a few years. So he's going to study their works and takes them as his inspiration. And he also is a Renaissance man known for multiple different things, but he's, again, probably most famous for his paintings. He is going to paint a painting called the School of Athens. And the School of Athens is based on Plato's school, Aristotle's school that was created. And he says, at this school were all the great thinkers past and present. And so it's like this imaginary gathering of great thinkers and scientists and everything. And he shows them all working together. They're all working towards a common goal. And it's kind of interesting because he includes himself in this painting as well. So it kind of shows you what he thought of himself, that he's kind of maybe a little stuck on himself, or he was at least proud of what he was doing. He's probably best known for his portrayals of the Madonna, which is Mary, Jesus' mother. And so he has numerous paintings and sculptures of her. Women artists of the Renaissance were also around. There just weren't there weren't very many. There's probably more than what we know about, but vast majority of them kept it as a secret, or they would have their husbands claim to do the work and take credit for it, because it wasn't considered a good thing for a woman to be an artist. If a woman was found to be an artist, there was usually some other assumptions made about her, especially about her virtue, of whether or not she was a good woman or not. So that was something they tried to avoid. Architecture will change in the Renaissance as well. They begin to reject the Gothic style of the late Middle Ages with the flying buttresses and the very tall ceilings and all that kind of stuff. They decide, nah, we don't want to do that anymore. So remember, they're very focused on the Roman culture and the Greek culture in the Renaissance period. So they're going to adopt the columns and the arches and the domes that were favored by the Greeks and the Romans. So we see that style come back. Writing, again, is going to be some changes. There's a lot of like how-to literature that is going to be published at this time, like how to become the ideal man of the times. And the ideal man for the Renaissance people was someone who was athletic, could participate in sports, but not overactive. You didn't want somebody who was constantly on the go. So athletic but not overactive. That they were good at games, so they could play well with others and participate in games, but they were not a gambler, so they didn't take it to the extreme. And the ideal man should also play an instrument, and he should know his history and his literature, but because he has all this knowledge, he should not be arrogant about it. He shouldn't be like looking down his nose at somebody else. So that's what the man's like. An ideal woman was supposed to be graceful and kind, and she was supposed to be lively, like fun to be around, but she was also supposed to be reserved, like she wasn't like in your face fun to be around. She was just, nice to be around. She was supposed to be pure, so very virginal, but not prudish, so she's not like stuck up about it, I'm better than you sort of thing. And she was supposed to be beautiful because, as everybody knows, that is a true sign of inner goodness, that if you are beautiful on the outside, you must be beautiful on the inside. Well, that's at least the assumption that was made by the Europeans in the Renaissance time. We know that's not true. So, another writer that comes at this time is Niccolo Machiavelli, and he's an Italian, and he writes a book called The Prince. And this Prince is a different sort of how-to book. It's how to be a good leader, or how to become a leader. And it looks at examples of real rulers rather than the ideal, because everybody wants to be an ideal leader, but it doesn't really work in reality. Reality says this isn't never going to happen. And so in his book, he's going to stress that, well, the ends justifies the means. Whatever it takes to get power, you should go do it, because that's what you need to do in order to get power. So you can use whatever methods were necessary in order to achieve your goals, and that results were more important than promises. So yeah, sure, you promise the people you're not going to raise taxes on them, but as soon as you get into power, if you need the money, you raise the taxes. It's great that you promised it, but you need the results. You need the money. You need the cash. So he said that was okay. And it's kind of interesting because Machiavelli really provided this realistic look at politics, even though the critics of his time said that he was inspired by the devil to write this. So there's a lot of people that are kind of not happy with him because they're like, we don't want people to think about our, especially the upper class, the nobles were very unhappy with this because they're like, we don't want the people to think that we're really like this and we're going to listen to your advice. But it actually ended up happening like that. So other writings that came about during this time, Francesco Petrarch, and he's a poet and he writes a lot of literature of his own, but he's probably most famous for his sonnets to Laura. And these were love poems that he had written, and they were written in the vernacular, so they were written in Italian, and they were inspired by this woman that he actually had never met. It's a woman he knew from a distance, that she was like a friend of a friend of a friend, like severely removed from him, but he was just so struck by her beauty that he falls instantly in love with her and writes these poems to her in order to express his love. So that's the Renaissance as it develops in Italy, and in the next video we're going to be looking at how the Renaissance is going to move north into northern Europe and how that is going to affect changes there.